The Red Keep was silent in a way it had never been before. Not the quiet of peace, but the uneasy hush that follows a storm before the next one strikes. Guards stood straighter than usual, eyes sharper, hands tighter around spear shafts. Nobles spoke in whispers instead of voices. Even the torches seemed dimmer, as if afraid to burn too brightly under the weight of what had just happened. Eddard Stark sat on the Iron Throne. It was never meant for him. That much was clear even to the throne itself, jagged blades jutting out like a warning. He sat carefully, not like a conqueror, but like a man trying not to bleed on something sacred. His stark cloak grey and heavy, with fur hung over the sharp metal like winter, refusing to accept fire. King Robert Baratheon was dead. The realm had no clear successor. Chaos should have followed. But instead, something stranger happened. Ned Stark was chosen, not by ambition, not by plotting, but by accident, loyalty, and the terrifying absence of anyone else willing to stand clean in the blood of politics. "Your Grace," whispered a voice beside the throne. It was Varys. Ned looked down at him, not trusting the man even now. "I am no king." Varys smiled faintly, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "That is precisely why half the realm will either love you or try to kill you." Ned's jaw tightened. He had heard this before in Winterfell, men who spoke in riddles instead of truth. He preferred swords. Swords did not lie. "Truth does not make a king," Ned said. "No," Varys replied softly, "but it makes a dangerous one." Across the hall, the great lords watched. Some bowed too quickly, some too slowly. Lannister gold gleamed in the distance like a threat pretending to be decoration. Tywin Lannister himself stood unmoving, face carved from old stone, already calculating the shape of the new world. And somewhere behind him, Cersei Lannister watched Ned Stark like a knife looking for skin. Ned could feel it, the weight of every gaze pressing against him. He had spent his life in the North, where honor was simple. You kept your word. You punished betrayal. You protected your people. But here, in King's Landing, honor felt like a language no one spoke correctly. "Bring me the small council," Ned ordered. The servant hesitated. "My lord, your grace, some of them have fled." "Then find those who remain," Ned said firmly. The servant ran. Varys stepped closer. "You understand what this means, don't you? The throne does not stay empty in practice. Power rushes in like water through broken stone." Ned's hand rested on the arm of the Iron Throne, and for the first time he felt it, not power, but resistance, as if the throne itself rejected him. "I will not rule through fear," Ned said. Varys tilted his head. "Then others will rule through fear of you not ruling." In that silence, Ned Stark made a choice that would shape the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. "I will rule through justice," he said. Varys almost laughed. He stopped himself just in time. "Justice," he repeated softly, as if tasting a word from an old, forgotten language. "In King's Landing, your grace, justice is often mistaken for treason." Ned looked out over the hall. The Iron Throne glinted like broken promises. Somewhere deep inside him he knew this was not Winterfell. Here, wolves did not rule. Here, wolves were hunted. And still he said it again, steady, unshaken. "Then let them fear justice." The realm had a new king, and it had no idea yet how much it would suffer for it. The days after Ned Stark took the Iron Throne did not feel like peace settling over the capital. It felt more like a wound being covered while still bleeding underneath. King's Landing did not change its nature just because a different man sat at its center. The streets were still hungry, the nobles still divided, and the Red Keep still full of people who smiled while thinking about daggers. Ned quickly learned that ruling was not like commanding men in battle. In war, the enemy stood on the other side. In court, the enemy often stood right beside you, offering wine and advice with the same hand. Ned tried to begin the way he always had by, calling for honesty. He ordered records of the kingdom's debts, demanded reports from every lord, and insisted on meeting those who governed the city watch. He believed that if he could see the truth clearly, then decisions would naturally follow. But truth in King's Landing was not a clean thing. It arrived, twisted, delayed, or dressed in half-lies. The royal treasury was worse than empty. It was a hollow promise wrapped in borrowed gold from House Lannister. The City Watch was loyal only as long as it was paid, and the pay came from debts Ned did not control. Tywin Lannister made sure to be present in every discussion where money was mentioned. He did not argue loudly. He did not need to. His presence alone made every room feel smaller. When Ned spoke of restructuring the kingdom's finances, Tywin listened carefully, then calmly explained the consequences as if speaking to a young lord who had not yet learned how the world truly worked. He spoke of rebellion risk, of trade collapse, of how houses like Stark, even with honor, could not rule without gold. Every sentence was polite, but every meaning was a chain. Ned did not trust him. That was the only certainty he held. Cersei Lannister, on the other hand, did not bother to hide her hostility behind lessons or warnings. She watched Ned like someone watching a mistake she expected to correct. In council meetings, she rarely spoke directly to him unless necessary, but her silence was never empty. It was sharp, measuring every decision he made, every hesitation he showed. Ned could feel her waiting for him to fail in a way that justified her presence in the court of a Stark king. It unsettled him more than open rebellion would have. Varys remained the only constant presence at Ned's side. The spy master moved through the keep like a shadow that had learned to speak. He brought information without being asked, whispers from Flea Bottom, rumors from the harbor, small truths that never made official reports. He told Ned about rising tension in the Gold Cloaks, about sellswords being quietly hired by unknown benefactors, about ships arriving with banners that did not match their declared origin. Ned did not always know what to do with this flood of unseen danger, but he listened. That alone made him different from the previous rulers who preferred ignorance until it turned into crisis. One evening, as the sun set behind the city and turned the sky into a dull burn of orange and smoke, Ned found himself alone in the throne room. The Iron Throne loomed over him like a silent judge. He had begun to understand why Robert had preferred drinking over sitting here. The throne did not offer comfort. It demanded weight. Every decision made here felt like it would echo far beyond the room, even if it seemed small in the moment. Varys entered quietly, as he always did. "Your Grace," he said, bowing slightly. "There is something you should know." Ned did not look at him immediately. "If it is more debt, I already know enough to lose sleep over it." Varys allowed a faint smile. "It is not debt, it is movement. House Lannister is not as still as they appear. Their influence spreads through the capital in ways that are not recorded in ledgers." Ned finally turned his head. "Say what you mean." Varys stepped closer, lowering his voice. "They are building alliances, not loudly, not openly, but carefully. Certain captains of the Gold Cloaks, certain merchants, even some minor lords who believe the future of Westeros will belong to whoever controls the throne after you." Ned's expression hardened. "I am the king." "Yes," Varys said gently, "but in this city, being king is not the same as being in control." That statement lingered in the air long after it was spoken. Ned felt it settle into his thoughts like a stone dropped into deep water. He had faced rebellion before in the north, but it had always been direct. Here, rebellion wore the face of loyalty until the moment it struck. "I will not rule by paranoia," Ned said firmly. Varys nodded as if he expected that answer. "No one is asking you to, only to understand that others already are." After Varys left, Ned remained in the throne room longer than he intended. He studied the empty hall, imagining it filled with enemies he could not see. It was an uncomfortable exercise, but one he could not ignore. Slowly, reluctantly, he began to understand the shape of the game being played around him. It was not about armies yet. It was about positioning, about who controlled what without ever drawing a sword. The first real fracture came 3 days later. A captain of the Gold Cloaks was found murdered near the river gate. His body was displayed not as a warning of chaos, but as a message of precision. No witnesses came forward. No evidence was officially recorded. But Varys arrived before dawn to tell Ned what the city would not say aloud. The captain had been one of the few loyal men who had resisted Lannister influence inside the City Watch. Ned ordered an investigation immediately. He demanded names, suspects, answers, but the city responded with silence. Fear filled the gaps where truth should have been. Even the remaining Gold Cloaks began to hesitate in their loyalty, unsure whether serving the crown meant serving Ned Stark or opposing unseen forces already tightening their grip. That night, Ned summoned his council again. Tywin Lannister attended without delay. Cersei came as well, her expression unreadable. Varys stood quietly at the edge. The room felt tighter than before, as if the walls themselves were listening. Ned spoke plainly. "There is corruption inside the City Watch. I want it removed." Tywin responded calmly. "If you remove too many at once, you weaken the structure that holds the city together." Cersei added softly, "Or perhaps you simply weaken those who keep order." Ned looked at both of them, sensing the coordination beneath their words, even if it was not openly stated. "Order built on hidden knives is not order," he said. Tywin's gaze did not change. "Order built on inexperienced rule collapses faster." The silence that followed was heavy. Ned realized then that every decision he made would be resisted not just with disagreement, but with calculated opposition. He was not simply governing a kingdom. He was attempting to replace an entire system that had learned to survive by feeding on itself. When the meeting ended, Varys remained behind. "You see it now," the spymaster said quietly. Ned did not answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the empty council table. "I see that the realm is rotten," he finally said. Varys inclined his head slightly, and rot does not respond well to honor alone. For the first time since taking the throne, Ned did not immediately reject the implication. Instead, he stood there in silence, realizing that justice in this place might require something he had always refused to become, something harder than honor, and far more dangerous. The weight of ruling King's Landing began to change Ned Stark in ways he did not fully notice at first. It was not a sudden transformation, but a slow erosion of certainty, like stone worn down by constant wind. Each day brought another contradiction between what he believed should happen and what actually kept the realm from falling apart. He had always thought of justice as something clear and absolute, but in the capital, justice often arrived late, incomplete, or already poisoned by influence. After the murder of the Gold Cloak captain, Ned ordered tighter discipline within the City Watch. But what he discovered disturbed him more than the crime itself. The Watch was not a single unified force. It was divided into small loyalties, each shaped by bribes, fear, or promises from powerful houses. Some men obeyed orders from the crown, others from unseen patrons, and many simply tried to survive without choosing sides at all. Ned realized that removing corruption was not like cutting away diseased flesh. In this city, the disease had grown into the body itself. Tywin Lannister used this moment to his advantage. He offered help, suggesting restructuring the Gold Cloaks under experienced commanders from trusted houses. His tone was always reasonable, always calm, but Ned could see the shape of control behind it. Accepting Lannister help would mean surrendering the City Watch in all but name. Refusing it meant keeping a broken system in place and risking more instability. It was a choice designed to trap him either way. Ned refused both options. He instead appointed men from the Riverlands and Stormlands, hoping neutrality would prevent manipulation. It was a decision made from principle rather than strategy, and it immediately created resistance. The local nobles in King's Landing saw outsiders as intruders, while the Lannister-aligned factions viewed them as temporary obstacles to be removed. Within days, those new commanders began reporting sabotage, missing supplies, delayed orders, and silent refusals from subordinates, who never openly disobeyed but never truly obeyed either. Varys observed all of this with quiet concern. He never openly criticized Ned's decisions, but his reports grew more detailed, more urgent. He spoke of patterns forming beneath the surface of the city, of alliances that were not official but deeply coordinated. He warned that someone was preparing the city not for rebellion, but for transition. Ned did not like the implication. It suggested that certain forces already believed his rule was temporary. Cersei Lannister's presence during this time became more direct. She began attending council meetings more frequently, speaking with sharper precision. She questioned every appointment Ned made, every reform he attempted, always framing her arguments as concerns for stability. Yet behind every concern was an attempt to redirect authority back toward the familiar Lannister influence. Ned found himself increasingly aware that she was not simply opposing him. She was shaping perception around him, turning uncertainty into doubt in the minds of others. One morning, a shipment of grain meant for the city's poorer districts never arrived. Instead, it was lost at the harbor. When Ned investigated, he found conflicting accounts. dock workers who claimed they never saw the shipment, guards who said they were ordered to redirect it, and officials who insisted paperwork had never been approved in the first place. Every explanation contradicted the next. It was not open defiance, it was structured confusion, a system designed so no single person could be held accountable. Ned realized then that the real power in King's Landing was not held through force alone, but through control of information. Truth itself could be fragmented until it lost meaning. That evening, Ned confronted Varys in the council chamber. "I want names," he said firmly. "Who is behind this interference?" Varys did not answer immediately. He folded his hands and studied Ned carefully, as if deciding how much truth the king could carry without breaking under it. "Names are dangerous things," he finally said. "They create targets, and targets create martyrs." "I am not asking for philosophy," Ned replied. "I am asking for the truth." Varys sighed softly. "The truth is that there is no single hand guiding this. It is not a blade. It is many fingers. Some belong to House Lannister. Some belong to merchants who fear instability. Some belong to men who simply prefer predictable power over uncertain change." Ned felt frustration building inside him. "Then I will remove each finger." "That would require seeing all of them," Varys said gently. "And some are already inside the hand you are trying to close." The implication unsettled Ned more than he wanted to admit. At the same time, whispers began spreading through the city. People spoke of the Stark King as honorable but weak. Others said he was dangerous because he did not understand the rules of ruling. In taverns, men debated whether the North had brought justice or chaos to the Iron Throne. These were not coordinated speeches, they were conversations, rumors that grew louder as they spread, each telling slightly different versions of the same fear. Tywin Lannister rarely spoke against Ned openly, but his influence began to manifest in council decisions that subtly constrained royal authority. Proposals that weakened noble privileges were delayed. Funding for northern initiatives was quietly reduced. When questioned, officials claimed logistical issues, not political intent. Yet the pattern was clear enough for Ned to recognize, even if he could not directly prove it. Cersei, meanwhile, began focusing on something more personal. She questioned Ned's reliance on Varys, suggesting that trusting a man with spies instead of loyalty was a dangerous weakness. She spoke of the Queen Regent's responsibilities in times of instability, subtly reminding the court that royal authority could be guided or redirected by those with stronger political instincts. Ned understood the underlying message. She was positioning herself as an alternative center of influence within his own rule. Despite all this, Ned refused to act harshly without evidence. It was a principle that defined him, but in King's Landing it became a limitation others exploited. His restraint was interpreted as hesitation. His honesty was interpreted as naivety. And every day that passed without decisive punishment allowed opposition to strengthen quietly. The breaking point came when a second shipment disappeared, this time not grain, but gold allocated for city defenses. The loss was too significant to ignore. When Ned demanded answers, the response was immediate and unified confusion. Records showed authorization. Guards claimed compliance. Clerks insisted procedures were followed correctly. Yet the gold had vanished without a trace. That night, Ned stood alone in the throne room longer than he had before. The Iron Throne loomed above him like a reminder of everything he was failing to control. For the first time, he began to understand that his rule was not being openly challenged. It was being slowly suffocated by systems designed to prevent any single truth from emerging. Varys entered quietly again, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. "You are beginning to see it," he said softly. Ned did not turn immediately. "See what?" "That in King's Landing," Varys replied, "power does not always remove kings. Sometimes it simply makes them irrelevant." Ned finally looked at him. "I will not become irrelevant." Varys met his gaze calmly. "Then you will need to decide what kind of king survives here, because the one you are trying to be does not last long in this place." The words lingered in the silence that followed. Ned Stark, who had once believed that honor alone could hold a realm together, now stood at the edge of a truth he had long resisted. In the capital, justice was not enough to rule, and refusing to adapt was beginning to look less like honor and more like a slow defeat. The tension inside King's Landing began to shift from quiet resistance into something more deliberate, almost organized, as if unseen hands were tightening around the city in response to Ned Stark's stubborn rule. What had once been confusion in administration started turning into pattern. Orders were delayed in specific places. Certain officials stopped responding entirely, and key decisions seemed to vanish into layers of bureaucracy that no one could fully trace. Ned could feel it now, not just opposition, but coordination. Someone or something was shaping the city around him, while pretending not to act at all. Ned tried to respond the only way he understood, by tightening fairness and enforcing direct accountability. He began making surprise inspections, calling officials into the Red Keep without warning, and demanding explanations face-to-face rather than through written reports that could be altered or lost. At first, this created fear among corrupt officials. But fear in King's Landing did not lead to honesty. It led to adaptation. People became more careful, more indirect, and more skilled at hiding intent behind procedure. Ned found himself chasing shadows that kept learning how to disappear better each time he reached for them. Tywin Lannister observed all of this with calm patience. He never interfered openly, but his influence grew in quieter ways. Noble houses that once hesitated now began aligning themselves more firmly with Lannister interests. Loans were adjusted, debts quietly recalled, and trade routes subtly redirected. It was not rebellion. It was pressure applied through economics instead of swords. Ned began to understand that Tywin did not need to fight for control of the kingdom. He only needed to ensure that anyone who tried to rule without him would slowly lose stability. Cersei's behavior changed as well. She grew more confident in council, speaking less like a guest and more like someone waiting for authority to eventually correct itself. She questioned Ned's reliance on northern loyalty, suggesting that outsiders would never understand the delicate balance of King's Landing. Her words were careful, but their purpose was clear: to isolate Ned politically, to make his decisions seem increasingly disconnected from the real needs of the realm. Over time, even neutral lords began repeating her arguments, not because they agreed with her completely, but because her version of events required less effort to believe than Ned's idealism. Varys, meanwhile, became both more present and more distant at the same time. He brought Ned increasingly urgent reports, but also began advising caution in a way that felt heavier than before. It was no longer simple information sharing, it was interpretation. Varys was no longer just showing Ned what was happening, he was showing him how fragile the situation had become. And beneath every warning, there was an unspoken suggestion that the kingdom might already be slipping beyond the reach of any single ruler. The real fracture came when the City Watch itself began to change behavior in subtle but undeniable ways. Patrols in poorer districts became inconsistent. Arrests of certain criminals stopped happening entirely. Meanwhile, minor incidents involving supporters of powerful houses were quietly ignored. It was not outright rebellion, but selective enforcement justice, applied unevenly, shaped by invisible priorities. Ned confronted the commanders directly, demanding explanation, but every answer returned to the same excuse: lack of clarity, conflicting orders, or administrative confusion. It was the same system that had hidden missing grain and gold, now expanded into law enforcement itself. Ned realized with growing frustration that he was not fighting individuals anymore. He was fighting a structure that had learned how to survive without ever revealing its center. One evening, a delegation from the city's merchant guild arrived at the Red Keep. They were polite, respectful even, but their message carried weight. They expressed concern about stability, about how sudden reforms were disrupting trade confidence. They did not accuse Ned directly, but the implication was clear. Uncertainty in leadership was harming the city. They suggested carefully that a more experienced advisory structure might help restore balance. Ned understood immediately that this was not their independent idea. It was language shaped elsewhere, delivered through intermediaries who could deny intent if challenged. After they left, Ned remained seated in the council chamber long after the doors closed. The room felt heavier than usual, not physically, but politically, as if every conversation that had ever taken place there had left residue in the air. Varys stood quietly nearby, watching him with a measured expression that revealed nothing and everything at once. "They are testing you," Varys said softly. Ned did not look up. "They are resisting corruption being removed." Varys tilted his head slightly. "Sometimes what we call corruption is simply the way a system keeps itself from breaking under pressure." Ned's eyes narrowed. "Are you defending them?" "I am describing them," Varys replied calmly. "There is a difference." That answer irritated Ned more than an argument would have. He stood from the table, walking toward the window that overlooked the city. King's Landing stretched outward like a living thing, dense, restless, unpredictable. A system that depends on dishonesty to function is already broken, he said. Varys joined him at the window. Then you are trying to fix something that does not wish to be fixed. Ned turned slightly. It does not get a choice. A pause followed. In that silence, the gap between them became clearer. Ned saw the city as something that could be corrected, like a failing system brought back into order through discipline and truth. Varys saw it as something organic, shaped by survival, adaptation, and compromise. Neither perspective allowed the other to exist without contradiction. The breaking point came unexpectedly through a small incident that, on its own, seemed almost insignificant. A noble from a minor house was arrested by the city watch for theft, but within hours he was released without explanation. No trial was recorded. No order was documented. When Ned demanded to know who authorized the release, every official involved either denied knowledge or pointed to someone higher in rank who could not be reached. The pattern was now fully visible. Decisions were being made without him, but always in ways that left no clear point of origin. Ned ordered a full restructuring of the administrative chain. He demanded that every command, every decision, every release or arrest be recorded directly under royal authority. It was an attempt to force transparency into a system designed to avoid it. But instead of compliance, what followed was slow resistance. Reports became delayed, clerks became unavailable, entire departments claimed overload. The structure did not break, it bent around him, absorbing pressure while maintaining its hidden core. Tywin Lannister finally spoke more directly during a council meeting. "Your Grace," he said calmly, "you are attempting to govern King's Landing as if it were Winterfell. This city does not respond to simplicity. It responds to balance." Ned met his gaze. Balance built on hidden manipulation is not balance. Tywin's expression did not change. It is survival. Cersei added quietly, and survival is what keeps the realm from tearing itself apart. Ned understood then that he was not simply being opposed. He was being outnumbered by a philosophy he refused to adopt. To them, control was not about truth or justice. It was about stability, even if that stability was built on unseen compromises. To Ned, that was unacceptable, but his refusal to bend was beginning to isolate him in ways that even honor could not protect. That night, as silence settled over the Red Keep, Varys returned once more. "You are approaching a point," he said quietly, "where your presence alone is becoming a disruption to the system they have built." Ned looked at him. "Good." Varys shook his head slightly. "No, not good. Dangerous. Because systems that feel threatened do not always negotiate." For the first time since taking the throne, Ned did not respond immediately. He simply looked out over the city, realizing that what stood before him was no longer a political struggle in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, more structural, a kingdom that did not want to be ruled in the way he believed it should be ruled. And slowly the realization began to form that if he continued on this path, King's Landing would not simply resist him. It would eventually decide that he could not remain king at all. The situation in King's Landing began to harden into something more dangerous than political resistance. It was no longer just a struggle between Ned Stark's ideals and the practical instincts of the capital. It was becoming a silent contest of endurance where every side tested how long the other could withstand pressure before something finally cracked. Ned could feel the change in the air of the Red Keep. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms more quickly than before. Servants bowed deeper but spoke less. Even council meetings had begun to feel like carefully staged performances rather than genuine discussions. Ned tried to respond by increasing transparency even further. He opened court hearings to the public, allowing common people to bring grievances directly before the crown. At first, this seemed like a step toward the justice he believed in. People came with real problems: unpaid wages, stolen land, abuses by minor officials. Ned listened carefully and issued judgments on the spot whenever possible. For a brief moment, it felt like progress. But that progress quickly became another battlefield. Nobles began complaining that their authority was being undermined by unpredictable royal interference. Local administrators became hesitant to enforce any decision without multiple confirmations. What should have been direct justice started turning into paralysis. Tywin Lannister observed these developments with increasing clarity. He did not oppose Ned's reforms openly. Instead, he began preparing for their consequences. House Lannister's financial control tightened subtly around the kingdom's institutions. Loans were adjusted in ways that gave them leverage over key regions. Supply routes tied to Lannister interests became more reliable than royal channels. It was not sabotage, it was dependency being reinforced. Ned was beginning to understand that even if he commanded the throne, he did not control the mechanisms that kept the realm functioning. Cersei's influence inside the court also deepened during this period. She began positioning herself not as an opponent to Ned, but as a necessary stabilizing presence within his rule. She advised certain compromises, always framed as temporary adjustments for the greater good. Over time, more lords began turning to her for guidance, especially when Ned's decisions created uncertainty. Without openly challenging his authority, she slowly built an alternative center of trust within the Red Keep. Ned noticed it, but every attempt to confront it directly only made him appear more rigid in the eyes of others. Varys, meanwhile, became increasingly difficult for Ned to read. His reports grew more detailed, but also more philosophical. He no longer simply described events. He interpreted their meaning, often in ways that made Ned uncomfortable. He spoke of power as something fluid, something that moved through people rather than being held by them. He suggested that the kingdom itself was adapting to Ned's rule in ways that were not necessarily hostile, but self-protective. According to Varys, systems always evolve to preserve stability, even if it meant resisting the person sitting on the throne. Ned rejected this interpretation, but he could not ignore the evidence forming around him. A pattern was emerging where every reform he introduced was either absorbed, diluted, or redirected. Even his most direct commands were being translated through layers of interpretation before reaching execution. It was as if the kingdom had developed an immune response to his style of rule. The tension escalated when reports arrived from the Riverlands of rising bandit activity. At first, this seemed like a standard issue of post-war instability, but further investigation revealed something more organized. The bandits were not simply criminals. They were coordinated, well-supplied, and strangely selective in their targets. They avoided Lannister holdings while striking at supply lines tied to royal authority. Ned saw this as a direct challenge to his control over the realm's security. He ordered immediate military action, dispatching forces to secure the affected regions. However, delays in mobilization once again appeared. Supplies arrived late, troop movements were slowed by administrative errors, and coordination between units became inconsistent. By the time the Crown's forces fully engaged, the bandits had already retreated, leaving behind only fragmented evidence of their organization. Ned could not prove who was behind it, but the timing and selectivity pointed towards something far more deliberate than simple chaos. Tywin Lannister denied any involvement when questioned, and his denial was technically clean. There was no proof linking him directly to the disruptions. Yet Ned understood that absence of proof in King's Landing did not equal absence of influence. It only meant influence had been applied carefully enough to avoid exposure. Cersei's reaction to the situation was more subtle. She questioned the wisdom of overreacting to what she called localized unrest, suggesting that excessive military response could destabilize already fragile regions. Her argument was not unreasonable on the surface, but it consistently leaned toward restraint whenever Ned attempted decisive action. Over time, her voice in council began to represent a form of counterbalance to Ned's authority, and many lords began to treat her words as unofficial guidance from within the royal household itself. The City Watch also began showing signs of deeper fragmentation. Certain captains began ignoring royal directives entirely in favor of local security priorities. Others followed orders but delayed execution until confirmation from unknown intermediaries. Ned attempted to replace leadership in key districts, but each replacement faced the same pattern of resistance. It was becoming clear that the problem was not individual corruption but structural control that extended beyond any single office. Varys finally delivered a warning that shifted Ned's understanding of the situation entirely. He informed him that messages had been circulating among noble houses, suggesting that the kingdom might soon require stabilization leadership. The phrase was deliberately vague, but its implication was unmistakable. It suggested that Ned's current rule was being quietly evaluated as temporary, and that preparations were already underway for an alternative arrangement if instability continued. Ned confronted Varys directly after hearing this. "Are you telling me there is a plan to remove me?" he asked, his voice controlled but tense. Varys did not deny it. "I am telling you that people are preparing for outcomes," he replied carefully. "And in King's Landing, preparation often looks like intention." Ned's expression hardened. "Then I will expose it." Varys shook his head slightly. "Exposure requires a center. There is no single center. That is the problem you are facing." That statement lingered long after Varys left the room. Ned began to understand that he was not dealing with a conspiracy in the traditional sense. There was no single mastermind to confront, no clear enemy to defeat. Instead, there was a network of aligned interests, each acting in its own survival, but collectively producing resistance to his rule. For the first time since becoming king, Ned felt something he had rarely experienced in his life. The sense that honor alone might not be enough, not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete for the structure he was now trying to govern. That realization did not change his principles, but it did begin to isolate him further from the world he was trying to save. And in that isolation, King's Landing began to quietly prepare for what came next. King's Landing began to feel different in a way Ned Stark could not immediately prove, but could no longer ignore. It was not open rebellion, not chaos in the streets, not armies gathering at the gates. It was something quieter and more dangerous than that. The city was starting to move without him in mind. Decisions were being made in places he was not part of, and by the time they reached him, they were already softened, redirected, or partially undone. It was as if the crown still existed, but its voice was slowly being translated into something weaker before it reached the realm. Ned started noticing it first in small administrative matters. Orders he issued directly were confirmed, yet their execution arrived altered in subtle ways. A punishment would be delayed for review. A dismissal would be temporarily paused. A decree would be reinterpreted for regional stability. Each change was minor on its own, but together they created a pattern of erosion. Authority was not being challenged openly. It was being diluted until it barely resembled itself. The council meetings reflected this shift more clearly than anything else. Tywin Lannister remained composed, always respectful, always precise in his language. Yet every suggestion he made carried the weight of inevitability, as if he was describing not what should happen, but what would happen, regardless of Ned's opinion. Cersei, meanwhile, had become more central to discussions involving court stability. Her arguments were no longer defensive. They were advisory, even instructive. Other lords began turning to her, not as opposition to Ned, but as guidance within his reign. That distinction mattered more than Ned initially understood, because it meant influence was no longer tied to formal authority. Varys continued to bring information, but now his tone had changed. He was no longer simply reporting events. He was preparing Ned for consequences. He spoke about how the city adapts to leadership styles, how systems resist abrupt disruption, and how power in King's Landing behaves like water finding its own level. Ned listened, but each conversation left him with a growing awareness that the realm was not simply disobeying him, it was adjusting itself around him in a way that minimized his impact. The breaking point came in the Riverland situation. Reports confirmed that the bandit activity was not only continuing but expanding. Royal forces sent to suppress it were now facing coordinated resistance, yet every captured witness gave contradictory testimony about leadership. Some claimed the attacks were independent uprisings, others spoke of organized protection networks, and a few mentioned names that vanished before they could be verified. It was a web of uncertainty designed to prevent any clear attribution. Ned ordered a full military escalation. He demanded that the responsible regions be secured and that supply routes be reopened immediately. But this time, something unusual happened. His orders were not denied. They were accepted formally, acknowledged respectfully, and then implemented in ways that changed their outcome. Troop movements were approved but rerouted. Supplies were dispatched but insufficiently loaded. Command structures were followed, but communication between units broke down at critical moments. It was obedience in appearance, resistance in execution. Tywin Lannister later explained the situation in council with calm detachment. "Your Grace," he said, The riverlands are unstable. Force alone will not correct instability that has already adapted to survive force. Ned looked at him sharply. Are you suggesting I do nothing? I am suggesting, Tywin replied evenly, that action without structure leads to repetition, not resolution. Cersei added quietly, and repetition weakens authority more than inaction ever could. Ned understood what they were doing. They were framing failure not as resistance against him, but as consequence of his methods. If he pushed harder, he would appear reckless. If he pulled back, he would appear weak. Either way, the perception of control was slipping away from him. That evening, Ned met Varys alone in the council chamber. The city outside was dark, but alive with distant movement, lights flickering in the lower districts, ships arriving at the harbor, guards changing shifts and patterns that no longer fully aligned with royal schedules. The kingdom felt like it was functioning on a parallel rhythm. I want the center of this, Ned said firmly. Who is coordinating this resistance? Varys did not answer immediately. He walked slowly around the chamber, as if considering how to shape his response. There may not be a center in the way you are imagining, he said finally. What you are seeing is alignment, not command. Different groups acting in their own interest, but those interests now overlap in ways that produce consistent outcomes. Ned's patience was wearing thin. That is not an answer. It is the only answer that matches what is happening, Varys replied calmly. You are looking for a hand holding the knife. There may only be many hands, each believing they are holding something else. Ned turned away, frustrated. Then I removed the hands. Varys stopped walking. And if the system simply grows new ones? The question lingered. Ned did not respond immediately, because he already suspected the answer. In the following days, the political atmosphere inside the Red Keep grew even more controlled, but also more distant. Lords spoke carefully in his presence, choosing words that could not be easily used against them. Meetings became shorter. Decisions were summarized instead of debated. It was as if everyone had collectively decided that direct confrontation with Ned Stark was no longer productive and therefore unnecessary. That realization was more dangerous than open hostility, because it meant he was being slowly removed from the center of decision-making without being physically removed from power. Cersei's role in this shift became more visible. She was not openly challenging Ned, but she was increasingly present in situations where clarity was required. When disputes arose between houses, she offered mediation. When confusion appeared in policy, she offered interpretation. And slowly, without formal declaration, she became a secondary authority people relied on when Ned's decisions created uncertainty. It was not usurpation, it was substitution through necessity. Tywin, meanwhile, continued strengthening the structural independence of his influence. Loans to crown departments came with increasingly defined conditions. Trade agreements favored Lannister-controlled routes. Even minor administrative offices began aligning their procedures with Lannister financial expectations simply to ensure stability. It was not rebellion. It was integration of necessity into governance. Ned began to realize something deeply unsettling. He was still king in title, still seated on the Iron Throne, still issuing commands. But the kingdom was no longer reacting to him as the primary source of order. It was reacting to him as one factor among many, and increasingly, not the most reliable one. One night after another council session that ended in carefully worded disagreement, Ned remained alone in the throne room longer than usual. The Iron Throne loomed above him, unchanged, silent, indifferent. He thought about Winterfell, where justice was simple because everyone understood the same rules. Here, the rules themselves shifted depending on who's interpreting them. Varys entered quietly as always, but did not speak immediately. Ned finally broke the silence. Tell me honestly, am I losing control of this kingdom? Varys considered the question carefully. Control is not something King's Landing gives or takes easily, he said. It shifts. It adapts. What you are experiencing is not loss of control in the traditional sense. It is redistribution of it. Ned looked at him. That sounds like I'm losing it. Varys did not deny it. It depends on whether you believe control is something one person holds or something that exists between many. That answer did not comfort Ned. It clarified the scale of what he was facing, and that clarity was more troubling than ignorance had been. Because if Varys was right, then Ned was not simply being opposed. He was being replaced by a system that did not require him to function, and systems like that did not negotiate. They simply continued. The situation in King's Landing entered a phase where even Ned Stark could no longer pretend it was still the same struggle he had begun with. What once looked like resistance had now become structure. The city was not reacting to him anymore. It was operating around him. His orders still existed, his authority still technically stood, but both were being absorbed into a larger system that no longer treated him as its central force. It was like watching a river continue to flow, while a stone remained fixed in the middle, slowly being shaped not by power, but by constant pressure from all sides. Ned felt it most clearly in the way information reached him. Reports that once arrived directly now passed through multiple layers of verification. By the time they reached the throne room, they were already softened, stripped of urgency, and sometimes subtly reworded so that the original meaning was harder to grasp. When he demanded clarity, he was given structure. When he demanded truth, he was given versions of it that could not be directly disproven but also could not be fully trusted. Even his own council began speaking in a way that avoided definitive statements unless absolutely necessary. Tywin Lannister remained at the center of this shifting order, not by force, but by inevitability. His influence no longer needed visible action. It was embedded in expectations. When he spoke, he did not argue for outcomes. He described them as natural consequences. In council, he would point out what the kingdom would require, rather than what it should do. And slowly, without anyone openly agreeing, decisions began aligning with his framing. Ned noticed that even when Tywin was not present, his logic remained in the room, echoed by others who had absorbed his way of thinking without realizing it. Cersei's position had evolved even further. She was no longer just a voice in council. She had become a point of reference. Lords and officials began seeking her opinion before presenting matters to the crown, especially when they were uncertain how Ned would respond. This did not happen through decree or appointment. It happened through convenience. She was consistent, predictable in her priorities, and most importantly, she provided answers when Ned increasingly provided questions. Over time, that reliability transformed into authority in practice, even without formal recognition. Varys, however, had become the most unsettling presence for Ned. The spymaster no longer brought information as isolated reports. Instead, he presented patterns. He showed how small administrative delays connected to financial adjustments, how those adjustments aligned with noble communications, and how those communications subtly mirrored merchant guild movements. It was no longer about isolated incidents. It was about convergence. Varys was showing Ned that the city was not conspiring in a traditional sense, but that multiple independent interests were beginning to produce the same political outcome, a weakening of direct Stark authority. Ned refused to accept that this was natural. To him, it still felt coordinated, even if no single mastermind could be identified. And that uncertainty frustrated him more than clear opposition would have. He began issuing stricter commands, demanding faster execution, and requiring direct confirmation from lower levels of administration. But each attempt to tighten control only revealed how little control he actually had over the system beneath him. Orders were followed formally, but implementation continued to drift. Compliance existed on paper, while reality moved in slightly different directions. The breaking point came when a major decree regarding tax redistribution in the capital districts failed to take effect. Not openly rejected, not publicly challenged, but simply not implemented in practice. When Ned demanded explanation, he was given a layered response: clerical errors, delayed communication, and jurisdictional confusion between departments. Each explanation made sense individually, but together they formed something more troubling: a system capable of neutralizing authority without ever confronting it directly. Ned summoned Tywin, Cersei, and Varys together that night. The atmosphere in the council chamber was colder than usual, not because of temperature, but because of anticipation. Each of them understood that this was no longer routine governance. It was confrontation, even if no one had declared it as such. Ned spoke first. "My orders are not being carried out." Tywin responded calmly, as if discussing weather rather than political tension. "Your Grace, your orders are being recorded and acknowledged. The issue is implementation within a system that is no longer centralized in the way it once was. That is not acceptable," Ned said firmly. Cersei leaned slightly forward. What is acceptable is not always what is possible, she replied. The capital does not respond well to abrupt restructuring. It resists instability. Ned looked at her directly. Instability is what happens when authority is ignored. For a moment, silence settled over the room. Then Varys spoke carefully. Or when authority is no longer the only force maintaining order. Ned's gaze shifted to him. Explain. Varys hesitated, choosing his words with precision. What you are experiencing is not simple defiance. It is adaptation. The city has adjusted to your methods in a way that preserves its functioning while reducing disruption. This means your authority is no longer the sole determinant of outcomes. It is one influence among several. Ned's expression hardened. So I am being sidelined. No, Varys said quietly. You are being integrated into a larger system that no longer depends on singular direction. That answer struck deeper than Ned expected, because it reframed everything he had seen, not as sabotage, but as absorption. The kingdom was not rejecting him. It was continuing without needing him in the way he believed it should. After the council ended, Ned remained alone longer than usual. The Iron Throne above him seemed less like a symbol of power now, and more like a monument to accumulated compromise. He thought of Winterfell again, of clear loyalty, of direct responsibility, of a world where authority was understood rather than negotiated. That world felt distant now, almost unreal compared to the layered complexity surrounding him. In the following days, Ned attempted one final approach: direct reassertion of royal authority through visible enforcement. He ordered public trials for administrative corruption, demanding that officials involved in delayed or altered execution of royal decrees be brought before him personally. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. Arrests were made, hearings were scheduled, and attention returned to the throne. But what followed revealed the deeper resilience of the system he was facing. Witnesses became unavailable. Evidence became inconsistent. Testimonies contradicted each other in ways that made decisive judgment impossible without further delay. Every trial became a cycle of uncertainty rather than resolution. The more Ned pushed for clarity, the more the process expanded into ambiguity. Tywin observed this with quiet understanding. Justice requires structure, he said during one session. Without it, it becomes performance. Cersei added softly, and performance without acceptance loses meaning. Ned realized then that even justice itself was being reframed inside the system he was trying to control. Not denied, not destroyed, reinterpreted until it no longer functioned as absolute authority. That night, Varys approached him privately once more. You are approaching a threshold, he said. Ned looked at him. What threshold? The point where continuing to enforce your vision of order will require either breaking the system entirely or accepting that it no longer responds to singular command. Ned's voice was quiet but firm. I will not abandon justice. Varys nodded slightly. Then you must decide whether justice, as you define it, can survive in a system that no longer depends on it exclusively. The words hung in the air like something unfinished, something unresolved. Ned Stark did not answer immediately, because for the first time since taking the Iron Throne, he understood that the question was no longer whether he was a good king. It was whether the kind of kingship he believed in was still possible here at all, and King's Landing, silent and watching, gave him no answer, only continuation. The final collapse did not arrive in the way Ned Stark expected. There was no trumpet of war, no sudden betrayal in the open hall, no dramatic moment where steel met steel in a visible declaration of treason. Instead, King's Landing simply stopped responding to him in any meaningful way, as if the crown he wore had slowly become ceremonial rather than commanding. Orders still left his mouth, still carried the weight of authority by tradition, but by the time they passed through the layers of administration, council interpretation, and institutional delay, they had already been reshaped into something softer, something optional. Ned was still the king in title, but the realm had quietly begun behaving as if kingship itself had shifted elsewhere. It began with a council session that felt different from the start. Tywin Lannister arrived earlier than usual, composed as always, but there was a finality in his presence that Ned had not seen before. Cersei sat beside him, not as a challenger this time, but as someone already aligned with a decision that had been made outside the room. Even Varys, usually unreadable, carried a kind of silence that felt heavier than his words. When Ned entered, none of them rose in the way they once did. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but in that court, subtlety was everything. Tywin spoke first, his tone calm and precise. He did not argue, he did not accuse. He simply outlined the state of the realm, as if presenting a conclusion rather than a discussion. He spoke of administrative fragmentation, of declining efficiency in royal directives, of increasing reliance on alternative centers of coordination within the capital. Each sentence was measured, each observation framed as fact rather than opinion. By the time he finished, the implication was clear, even if it was never directly stated. The kingdom was no longer functioning under singular command. Cersei followed him, her voice quieter but sharper in its certainty. She spoke of stability, of the need for continuity, of the responsibility the crown bore to prevent further deterioration. But her language no longer centered on Ned as the source of authority. Instead, she spoke around him as if his presence was one element in a larger equation rather than its defining factor. That was when Ned realized the shift had already completed itself in the minds of those around him. They were no longer debating his rule. They were managing its transition. Varys finally spoke last, and when he did, there was no hesitation. "Your Grace," he said softly, "the realm has adapted. What you are experiencing is not rebellion in the traditional sense. It is succession through necessity." Ned looked at him, something tightening in his expression. "Succession without my consent is treason." Varys did not flinch. In a system that no longer recognizes singular dependency, consent becomes secondary to continuity. That sentence settled over the room like a verdict already passed. Ned turned settled over the room like a verdict already passed. Ned turned slowly to Tywin. "Is this your doing?" Tywin met his gaze without hostility. "It is the realm's doing," he replied. "You have ruled with principles that do not allow for adaptation. The realm has responded by creating mechanisms that ensure its survival, regardless of those principles." Cersei leaned slightly forward. "No one is overthrowing you, Lord Stark. That would create instability. This is preservation." Ned understood then that the language itself had become part of the weapon. Words like preservation, continuity, and stability were being used to describe his removal without ever acknowledging it directly. For the first time since taking the Iron Throne, Ned felt the full weight of isolation. Not physical isolation, but structural. The realization that even his authority to reject what was happening was now dependent on systems that no longer prioritized his decision-making. The next hours unfolded not as confrontation, but as administration. Notices were delivered to the Red Keep. Orders were quietly reclassified. Command structures were realigned under a temporary regency framework for the stability of the realm. Guards still bowed to Ned when they saw him, but their instructions no longer originated from him. They originated from the council acting collectively, a body that now functioned independently of royal input. Ned walked through the Red Keep that evening and saw it clearly for the first time. Nothing had changed physically, yet everything had changed in function. Servants moved with purpose that no longer required royal direction. Courtiers spoke in pairs rather than before him. Even the throne room itself felt less like a seat of decision and more like a place where decisions were now merely recorded. When he finally returned to the council chamber, it was empty, except for Varys waiting near the table. "They have decided," Varys said quietly. Ned did not sit. "Decided what?" "That the realm requires a transitional governance structure," Varys replied, "one that distributes authority more broadly to prevent instability." Ned's voice was low, controlled. "And I am no longer part of that structure." Varys hesitated only slightly. "Not in the way you were." Silence followed, the kind of silence that does not ask for response because none is expected. Ned finally spoke. "So this is it. I am being removed without being removed." Varys inclined his head slightly. "You are being replaced in function, not erased in presence. That distinction matters to them." Ned let out a slow breath, looking down at the table. For a moment, he thought of all the choices he had made, every refusal to bend principle into compromise, every attempt to enforce clarity in a place that survived on ambiguity. He realized now that none of those choices had been wrong in isolation, but together they had placed him against something that did not operate on the same rules he did. "I will not endorse this," Ned said finally. "You are not being asked to," Varys replied. "Endorsement is no longer required for continuation." That was the final truth of it. The kingdom no longer needed his approval to move forward. Later that night, Ned stood once more in the throne room. The Iron Throne loomed above him, unchanged, but it no longer felt like it belonged to him in any meaningful sense. It felt like a relic of a system that had already evolved beyond its design. Guards were still present, but their attention was divided between duty and new instructions that did not originate from him. The crown still rested on his authority, but that authority was no longer the source of action within the realm. Cersei entered quietly, followed by Tywin. There was no hostility in their presence now, only finality. "You have a choice," Tywin said calmly. "Remain as a symbolic ruler, or step away and allow the transition to complete without conflict." Ned looked at him. "And if I refuse both," Cersei answered this time, "then the system will proceed without your participation. Either way, the outcome remains unchanged." Ned understood then that this was not a coup in the traditional sense. There was no need for force because resistance itself had been rendered irrelevant. The kingdom had reorganized around him, not against him, until his role had simply stopped being necessary. For a long moment, Ned said nothing. Then he turned away from them, looking up at the Iron Throne one last time, not as a seat of power, but as a reminder of what power meant in a place like this. In Winterfell, power was loyalty. In King's Landing, power was adaptation, and he'd never learned to become what this city required. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "Then the realm has its answer." No one corrected him. No one needed to. By morning, Ned Stark was no longer the functioning authority of the Seven Kingdoms, not through execution, not through execation, not through exile, not through rebellion, but through replacement by a system that had learned to survive without him. And King's Landing continued exactly as it always had. Only now, it did so without waiting for a king who believed it should. After Ned Stark's authority faded into something ceremonial, King's Landing did not erupt into celebration or collapse into chaos. It simply adjusted, like a body finding a new balance after an old bone had been set differently. The transition was almost unsettling in its smoothness. There were no public proclamations announcing his removal, no dramatic declarations of victory from any single house, no visible moment where power changed hands. Instead, decisions continued to be made, orders continued to be executed, and the machinery of the realm kept moving forward without interruption. The only real difference was that Ned Stark was no longer the point around which those decisions revolved. Inside the Red Keep, Ned still remained physically present for a time, though his presence became increasingly irrelevant to the flow of governance. Council meetings continued, but now they occurred without waiting for his approval to begin or end. Matters of state were discussed, resolved, and recorded as collective decisions of the realm's governing structure, with his input no longer considered decisive. When he spoke, people still listened out of courtesy, but not out of necessity. That distinction was small in appearance, but absolute in consequence. Tywin Lannister maintained his usual composure during this period, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. He continued to advise on stability, trade, and military readiness, but now his words were received as part of a functioning system rather than competing authority. Cersei stood settled into her expanded role within the new structure of governance, her influence now formalized through procedures rather than personality. Varys remained, as always, in the background, but his gaze carried a quiet acknowledgement that what had unfolded was not victory or defeat in the traditional sense. It was evolution driven by necessity rather than ambition. Ned struggled most with the absence of confrontation. In the north, even betrayal had clarity. A man either stood with you or against you, and the line between those positions was visible in action. In King's Landing, however, opposition had dissolved into administration. There was no enemy to strike, no rebellion to crush, no single betrayal to confront. Instead, there was a system that no longer required him, operating with complete normalcy as if his role had simply expired. That lack of a target made resistance feel meaningless, and for the first time in his life, Ned found himself unable to direct his sense of justice toward anything tangible. Days passed in this new reality. He walked the halls of the Red Keep, and saw life continue without disruption. Guards rotated shifts according to updated protocols. Messengers delivered orders that did not originate from him. Servants carried out instructions with steady efficiency, none of which required royal intervention. Even the Iron Throne Room, once the center of every decision, now functioned more like a symbolic chamber where outcomes were recorded rather than decided. The realm had not fallen into disorder. It had simply moved on from needing a singular moral anchor. One evening, Ned found Varys waiting for him near the edge of the council chamber. The spy master's expression was calm, but there was something subdued in his demeanor, as if even he recognized the weight of what had taken place. "You understand now," Varys said quietly. Ned did not respond immediately. He looked out toward the distant city through the tall windows of the Red Keep. "I understand that I was never as in control as I believed," he said at last. Varys nodded slightly. "Control was never the right word for what you were attempting to do here." Ned turned toward him. "Then what was it?" "A singular moral framework applied to a system that does not operate on singularity," Varys replied. "The realm does not reject justice. It distributes it." Ned's expression tightened slightly. "And what remains of justice when it is distributed without principle?" Varys paused before answering. "Survival, continuity, stability. The things kingdoms prioritize when they fear fragmentation more than they fear compromise." Ned understood the implication, even if he did not accept it. In Winterfell, justice defined survival. Here, survival defined justice. Later that night, Ned stood alone once more in the throne room. The Iron Throne still dominated the space, but it no longer felt like an instrument of rule. It felt like a relic of an older structure that had been gradually bypassed by something more flexible and less personal. He studied it for a long time, not with anger, but with a growing sense of distance, as if he were looking at something that no longer belonged to the same world he now occupied. Cersei entered quietly, stopping a few steps behind him. "You could remain," she said after a moment. "There is still a place for you here, if you accept what this has become." Ned did not turn immediately. "What it has become is not what I agreed to build." "No one builds kingdoms alone," she replied. "They grow beyond intention." Tywin arrived shortly after, as if the timing had been arranged in advance, though nothing about him suggested haste. "The realm will not return to its previous state," he said calmly. "That path is closed." Ned finally turned to face them both. There was no anger in his expression now, only clarity. "Then it will continue without me." No one argued, because it already was. By the time dawn approached, Ned Stark had left the center of power not through defeat in battle, not through execution or exile, but through irrelevance within a system that no longer required a singular moral authority to function. King's Landing did not remember the moment he stopped being king, because no such moment existed in a visible form. It simply adapted. Ned Stark's departure from the center of authority did not leave a void in King's Landing. It left a system that had already learned how to operate without waiting for one man's judgment. The Red Keep continued to function, the council continued to meet, and the realm continued to move forward with the same steady, indifferent rhythm it had settled into during the transition. What had changed was not the existence of power, but its shape. It was no longer concentrated in a single throne-bound figure trying to impose order through principle. It had become distributed, layered, and self-correcting in ways that no longer depended on Ned Stark's vision of justice. In the days that followed, Ned remained within the Red Keep for a short time, not as a ruler, but as a figure the court had not yet formally defined a role for. There was no hostility toward him, no open disrespect. Instead, there was something more unsettling. Procedural neutrality. He was neither opposed nor obeyed. He was neither opposed nor obeyed. He was simply no longer required for decisions to proceed. Meetings happened without him. Reports were finalized without his approval, and judgments were issued in his absence without hesitation. The kingdom was not rejecting him. It had simply moved past the point where his involvement altered outcomes. Tywin Lannister continued to advise the governing structure with the same calm precision he always had, but now his influence no longer competed with Ned's authority. It flowed through a system that had already integrated his way of thinking. Cersei remained present within court affairs, her voice now part of the formal balancing of interests that replaced singular command. Varys observed everything with quiet understanding, aware that what had taken place was not a coup or a failure of rule in the traditional sense, but a transformation of how power itself was distributed in the capital. Ned, however, understood something different. For him, it was not simply a political shift. It was a fundamental rupture between two ideas of governance that could not coexist in the same structure. In Winterfell, leadership was personal, anchored in loyalty, honor, and direct responsibility. In King's Landing, leadership had become procedural, adaptive, and detached from any single moral center. Neither system was inherently victorious. They were simply incompatible. And in this city, incompatibility did not lead to collapse, it led to replacement. On his final morning in the Red Keep, Ned walked through the halls one last time. The castle was already awake, already functioning, already moving forward without hesitation. Guards passed him with respectful acknowledgement, but no expectation of command. Servants continued their duties without pause. Even the air of the place felt unchanged by his presence, as if the building itself had already accounted for his absence in its daily rhythm. When he reached the gates, there was no ceremony, no farewell from the council, no final declaration of exile or resignation. There was only passage. Varys met him briefly near the outer courtyard. "It was never going to hold in the way you expected," he said quietly. Ned looked toward the city beyond the Red Keep walls. "Then it was never meant to be held that way," he replied. Varys inclined his head slightly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it simply cannot be held that way here." There was no argument left between them, only understanding shaped by experience rather than agreement. Ned Stark left King's Landing without spectacle. There was no announcement of defeat, no public acknowledgement of victory from any house, no visible fracture in the realm that marked his departure as an ending. The city continued exactly as it had before, governed by its redistributed structure of authority, shaped by competing interests that now functioned in uneasy but stable balance. Behind him, the Iron Throne remained, no longer the center of a kingdom waiting to be ruled in a single voice, but a symbol of a past age when power was expected to belong to one man at a time. That expectation no longer defined the world Ned was leaving behind. King's Landing endured, and in its endurance, it proved something Ned Stark had never fully accepted, that not all systems are meant to bend toward one man's sense of justice, even when that justice is honest. Some simply evolve beyond him.